Good morning, everyone. My name is Benjamin O'Connor. I'm a director at New London Architecture. I'm delighted to welcome you to this event celebrating LGBT plus spaces. London is home to a large LGBT plus community that play a vital role in the capital's economy, culture, and society, helping to make London one of the most vibrant and exciting cities in the world. Yet with declining numbers of LGBT plus venues across London and rises in hate crime, along with the ongoing impact of COVID-19, including mental health issues, isolation, living in unsafe environments and homelessness, it's more important than ever to create a safe and inclusive places for queer people to live, work and visit. Queer spaces go beyond just gay bars. They can include coffee shops, community centres or intramural sports leagues, but also neighbourhoods or portions of public spaces like beaches or libraries known to be friendly to and mostly frequented by the community. Originally, this event coincided with Pride in London, which has unfortunately been cancelled this year, but today's event will showcase some of the projects and initiatives that support and engage the LGBT plus community, helping to create visibility, unity and equality across the city and ensure London remains a queer-friendly city. This event forms part of our Diverse Leaders programme, and you can find out more about the programme and our Diverse Leaders industry pledge on our website at nla.london. A quick reminder that there will be a chance to ask our speakers some questions at the end using the Zoom Q&A button. So please do post your questions throughout the event, and I'll try and get to as many of those as possible during our panel discussion. Our first speaker today is David Kay, architect at Charles Braddon Lewis, who will present his research on the importance of London's queer spaces. David, over to you.
Thanks very much, Ben. Just check I've got screen control. There we go. Thanks, Ben. So my name is David Kay. I'm an architect at Charles Braddon Lewis Architects. I use he, him, his pronouns. And I'm really excited to be able to present to you some of my research that I did during my master's, looking at LGBTQ plus spaces across London, how they've been lost and how we can look to protect them. At this point, I just need to caveat that I am a cisgender white gay man, so my lived experience is not encompassing of all LGBTQ plus people. So I can't speak on behalf of the whole of the queer community, but I will try to be as inclusive as I can throughout what I present today. This first slide is way too small for you to all see, but it's really important just to set the scene for me. The last 50 years or so of decriminalization, discrimination, the impact that the sort of political and social sphere has had on queer people across the UK and across London. So in '67, obviously, there was the partial decriminalization of same-sex homosexual acts between men. Obviously partial because it didn't bring parity between same-sex relationships and heterosexual relationships. We then got the period starting in the 80s where the HIV and AIDS crisis hit, and in the middle of that, Section 28 was brought in by Margaret Thatcher, which actually ran through all the way through to the turn of the millennium. More recently, obviously, there was the Same-Sex Marriage Act passed, which was clearly a huge step forward in terms of equality. And then more recently to that, the Civil Partnerships Act was then also brought into equal terms, allowing heterosexual couples to get civilly partnered. And then, of course, very, very recently, we've had the COVID-19 pandemic, which has caused several issues, well, many issues for LGBTQ plus venues facing the challenges of not being able to open and losing their revenue streams. In addition to that, there are still ongoing homophobic attacks and homophobic culture within our society and across what we would consider to be the more progressive developed world. So we've seen a lot of attacks in Spain recently. And I think that highlights that there is still an issue of discrimination within our society. So looking at queer space, and the term queer itself is one of those terms which it can be controversial, but I quite like it as a term that's gone from being a slur to an appropriated term. And it's an umbrella term that really encompasses all sorts of people. Whether you're LGBTQ or plus, you can use the term queer. Now, in terms of defining queer space, this is a quote from Aaron Betsky, a sort of outspoken architectural academic and writer. And he describes queer space in 1999 as a useless, amoral, and central space that lives only in and for experience. It is a space of spectacle, consumption, dance, and obscenity. I think that's a really wonderful description. More recently, in 2017, Aaron Betsky actually wrote in the journal Log that he thought the queer space was dead, and I take issue with that. So in terms of my thesis research, leading on from Betsky's description, my question was, as a cultural, conceptual and ephemeral condition, can queer space be found or designed? Can queer space be enabled whilst also protected as a critical space of identity, belonging, community and desire in a city of exceptional gentrification and inequality? Now, in defining queer space, I broke it into three categories: formal, digital and informal. When I talk about formal, which I'll speak about today, I'm looking at things like gay bars, gay nightclubs, gay community centres, but also moments within the LGBT calendar like Pride, which unfortunately has been cancelled tomorrow. The other spaces include digital, so we're all aware of things like Grindr and the apps, and some of these are very specialist and very niche, some of them are focused on very sort of adult type behaviour, others are more inclusive. And then on top of that, we've got informal space, and my definition of informal space really stems from how queer spaces manifest within the heteronormative world, and that looks at the way in which spaces are appropriated, how cruising occurs within public areas and spaces like that. So focusing in on formal queer space, these figures are taken from the UCL Urban Lab study into LGBT nightlife interim report from, I think, 2016 or 2017. And it shows some quite stark loss of LGBTQ plus venues since 2006. Whilst we have lost straight venues, there is a disproportionate loss of queer venues in the city. And when you look at it in terms of the map, you can really see that shrinking down of the number of queer spaces across London. And admittedly, this is focusing primarily on nightlife, so it doesn't include spaces for community spaces, LGBTQ plus living, health spaces, stuff like that. But I think it's indicative of an onward trend. So zooming into one of the most iconic sort of queer parts of the city, Soho, and I thought this photo of Madame Jojo's now gone really embodies the sort of cultural and excitement of what a queer space can be. And when Madame Jojo's was lost, it was like that Soho lost a part of its soul, and people held vigils for the loss of Madame Jojo's and the loss of Soho's soul. And I think it's really important that identifies this really important heritage and community that queer spaces bring to the city. To put it into numbers, at least 18 venues in Soho have been lost, and they're not only drinking venues. Things like the First Out Cafe Bar, which was a non-alcohol focused space, was lost due to the Crossrail redevelopments at Tottenham Court Road. We've also lost specialist shops and community spaces within Soho. And it's not just Soho that's been impacted. So this is a study I did of North East London, looking at King's Cross, Angel, up to Highbury and across to Dalston, and all of those red dots are venues, they are nights, like queer nights, they're shops, they're important community assets that have been closed down. And what you see is that the remaining spaces are out towards Dalston and Haggerston, where we've got Dalston Superstore and more recently the Karaoke Hole and also the Glory. But that identifies the shift towards places where spaces are cheaper. And this idea of gentrification putting queer venues sort of on the line and pushing them to cheaper parts of the city is clearly an ongoing trend. To zoom in at a more sort of specific case study, we look at XXL, which was a vast sort of bare nightclub in the Southwark Arches. And this isn't a critique of the architecture that's being proposed. I need to be clear about that. But it's more a critique of how, as placemakers, architects, designers, planners, how can we ensure that we protect our cultural assets and protect the communities that use those spaces. And there is a question, do we need those spaces still? And this was a recent tweet from XXL. And XXL is still existing, but not with its own home. So they come and they pop up in other clubs, other venues. And there is a question to ask, is that enough? And I know there's talk of a new XXL club in London in the future, but I guess that's a question I would pose. Do we need dedicated spaces, or can they be more ephemeral and temporal? Another example, a really famous, iconic example, is the Royal Vauxhall Tavern, the sort of iconic South London gay cabaret venue. Some of the best nights there with Duckies, with Amy LeMay, and Princess Diana, in theory, used to hang out there. I wasn't born back then, but sorry, can you still hear me, Mike?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. Okay, great. But Royal Vauxhall Tavern's been under threat for redevelopment for many years, and there have been a number of different tools explored to try and protect it. First of which is using historic listings. Now, the building itself wasn't deemed to have significant enough architectural merit to get a listing on its own, and it wasn't deemed to have enough cultural merit to be listed for its cultural assets. But combined together, it was considered for Historic England listing as a combined architectural and cultural asset to the city. Other means are, can we utilise planning use classes, not so much to ultimately protect forever, but as a delaying tactic whilst we build up the arguments to protect our queer spaces? Can we use sui generis as a means for defining the RVT as a LGBTQ+ venue, and that would then slow the process down with the need for change of use to any new venue? The other thing is, can we utilise things like Section 106 to in perpetuity protect our queer spaces across the city? And I know that the Royal Vauxhall Tavern isn't the only example of this. I've put this slide in about the Joiners' Arms, but I'm really conscious that there's a far more qualified speaker to speak about this, so I will brush over this quickly. But you can see here where development is set to come in, the loss of the Joiners' Arms has led to what is effectively a very sorry state for what was a fantastic queer venue. I wanted to pick up on a good news story because I think this last year has been pretty horrendous for all of us. And I know that Jeremy Joseph, who owns GAY and Heaven Clubs, has been outspoken throughout the year in terms of the impact on nightlife and the leisure and hospitality businesses. But I really enjoyed seeing pictures on the news of Get Vaxxed at Heaven. I don't know if I'd want to have the side effects of my vaccine and a Heaven hangover necessarily, but I thought it was a really great way of encouraging younger communities and younger queer people particularly to get their vaccines, and using this iconic location and this home for queer nightlife as a place for this to occur. So just to wrap up where I'm at, why is formal queer space important, and why should we protect it, I guess? In essence, it's a safe space. It's a space where people can be themselves. And on top of that, it's a space of inclusion. So you, as a queer person, can be there surrounded by people similar to you. There is a lot of heritage within our queer spaces, not just architectural built heritage, but also social heritage. And on top of that, communities, and people build up communities and friendships through these spaces. Penultimately, we've got specialist spaces like XXL, which is specific for a certain clientele, but also spaces which deal with the challenges that certain LGBTQ+ communities have to negotiate in their everyday lives. And then on top of that, they are just really good fun spaces to be in very often. So I think it was really important just to recognise them as a fun part of our city. So just to wrap up there, I want to thank the NLA for inviting me to speak here, and apologies for the rapid flow of my this presentation, but there was quite a lot to go through. And I will pass you back to Ben as we move on.
Thank you very much, David. It was a really good overview of everything we're going to be thinking about today. And I remember when Crossrail was announced, actually, I think it's 3 or 4 venues that actually went, wasn't it? So hopefully we can get into that in more detail during our panel discussion. So thank you very much. So our next speaker is Patrick Devlin, who's a partner at Pollard Thomas Edwards Architects, who is going to present their design for the UK's first LGBT+ retirement community for tonic housing. Patrick.
Thank you very much for the invitation to talk to today's event. It's a really important one, I think. I'm Patrick Devlin. I'm a partner at Pollard Thomas Edwards. We've been working with tonic housing and supporting them since 2016. We have not actually got to the stage of designing an LGBT+ affirming retirement community, which is their mission statement, but they are moving into Bankside, and there's lots of news about that at the moment, and I think there will be parties and tours and all sorts to get into that. What I was going to do today was just take you through some early work we did with them with Tonic on what an LGBT+ retirement community might look like as determined by the people who would want to live there. the people it would be for. So we do a lot of co-housing work and a lot of co-design work. And this is an early workshop, been pointed out, it's not their logo anymore. I got pulled up on that. And it used Tonic's networks to bring people in to our office. We had a few other workshops elsewhere to talk about what LGBT people from all the various communities feel that they need when they get older, in a physical sense, in a development, but also in a sense that will affirm the individual's identity. And we started talking about the idea of an intentional community, which is the bond between a group of people who share characteristics that, I'm sorry, I'm just trying to, there we go, in common, who want to be together, live together, have things in common, identify in common. And then there is a huge conversation about to what extent, this meshes really well with the last presentation, what extent people wish to declare themselves to the outside world, and how does that fit with security, safety, ease of life and comfort. So these are just some early sketches from workshops we went through with them. What we'll do now is just have a look at the co-design process for people. What we try to do, whoever the intentional community of people who would like to live together, we try to facilitate what they want to do, to give them the tools to tell us what the building they want is, and what it should say about them, and what it should be like to live in. And this fits perfectly, I think, with Tonic's strapline, one of their straplines on their website. This is how we live our lives out. Okay, so that is a description of pride, of inclusion, and affirmation. It's the opposite, this kind of intentional community, of queer communities, LGBT communities who have been pushed into the closet, back into the closet as they get older, something that has not yet fully been dealt with, I'm ashamed and sorry to say. There's a little clip here coming up. I hope I can make it work, from a Tonic film, which puts this really clearly.
It's very easy to forget how many people didn't make it. There are people that committed suicide, there are people that ended up in psychiatric hospitals. The prejudice is still there. We can forget now, because we've got gay marriage and everything else like that, that there has been a tremendous cost. And we've got that in our memories. Some people may still be alive. They'll be going back in the closet as a way of surviving into their very old age. And that's tragic and very, very sad.
So Tonic's early research showed that, having talked to a number of housing associations in London, most or all of them said LGBT plus provision in retirement housing wasn't an issue because there were no LGBT plus identified people in any of their developments, which is, I think, impossible, more or less. But it raises this question of to what extent do we express in the buildings, and the people who can determine that are the people who are going to live in them. So here, a couple of examples: Lebensort Vielfalt in Berlin, and the Los Angeles LGBT Center, which has got a really strong form. So the flags in the Berlin example, referring back to the history of Pride and all sorts of rainbow coalitions in the movement. The strong physical form of the Los Angeles LGBT Center, be really interesting to know where that came from in the group, and whether it was came from users and potential residents, or whether it was an idea of the architects they wanted to do. I don't know enough about that. This sets out some of the possibilities for self-expression within LGBT plus retirement housing. So as well as being overt in those different ways, it might also, and this is just the expression towards the outside, it might also be more tacit. So this is not an LGBT development, it's older women's co-housing in Barnet. From the street, it's in a conservation area, so planning restrictions meant it couldn't be too overt. But actually, the women's desire was to have something that was all about light and the garden. And from the street, it's very conservative. When you get into the development, it is all about the garden and daylight, and expressing the ethos of the group and how people want to live. This is a project we're at the beginning of. I'm really, really excited about this, because this is the first lesbian co-housing, retirement development. We've been involved with, would be the first one in the UK, London Older Lesbian co-housing. This was a very early sketch before a co-design process that hasn't started. And it was something that we used just to suggest one end of that extreme. On the ground floor, you might have a really inviting entrance through to green space and garden, and that might identify you in the community. There's a huge tendency in construction to go straight from, okay, what's the design, let's get it built. And we're just starting the process of co-designing with the future residents what they want their building to be and what they want it to say to the world around them, as well as what its characteristics should be for the people who are going to live there. The last section to go through, which I hope we've thought-provoking, arises from the workshop process with Tonic, and we started coming up with taking on board the various groups who we've been listening to. What are the characteristics of an LGBT plus retirement community, and how can we make sure that they're being incorporated in designs as they come through? And we'll just pick up on some of these and explore some of the words and ideas that are involved with them. The first one, visible. So as I alluded to at the beginning, and maybe we shouldn't dwell on this too much, that's not a given, it's a question to people. Do you want to be visible from the street? Do you want to be findable? Do you want to be on that map we saw earlier? Or do you want to be more private? And that is a choice, it's not a given. And then physical connectivity to the surroundings. So as we saw with the London Older Lesbian co-housing, one possibility is something very inviting and open, as long as that's combined with security. There's a bullet point out, sorry, too small to read, sorry. A proud building, is it? Is it architecturally striking? Does it give that impression to the wider world? Is it a flagship? Related to that is the idea of engagement, how it engages with its surroundings, where you can get to from its entrances. And this relates to security, both for LGBT people and older people. There are issues with security. People don't only need to be secure, they need to be physically able to exclude people they don't want to see, from salesmen to anybody else. But they also want to carry on interacting with the world around them, and that is an architectural problem to grapple with, and there are lots of ways to do it. But understanding people's needs is the first thing to do. That's the thing that drives everything else. And then the idea of adaptability and flexibility. That could be a whole 10 minutes on its own, and I won't go too far into it. But the idea of something that's adaptable is that over time, you could move a wall or a wet room, or you could combine two flats, and that would accommodate different groups of people. The idea of flexibility is more sliding doors and screens and opening and closing over a day or a week. Healthy buildings are a massive issue. Air quality is becoming a massive issue. This is a given for any high quality retirement community, retirement housing. Are there aspects of the health agenda that are particularly relevant to members of the LGBT community? And again, that's something that people's lived experience we need to listen to and understand, and then we can propose things back that might, the building might be able to be supportive in particular ways. And again, with accessibility, it's a given for high quality retirement housing. It must be accessible, for example, to people in wheelchairs, to people who are visually impaired, to people with different cognitive impairments. And again, the question is, how does that mesh with a feeling of domesticity, a feeling of stylishness? What are the people who are coming to live here? What are their priorities about this? So access is the base. What's the expression on top of that? And finally, diverse, proud, things that I as a straight man am not qualified to talk about, but what I'm here to do and what we're doing in our work is listening to and enabling all of our residents and clients across different communities. And we've done some interesting work on how different groups with different aspirations might work, live in the same building, and engage when they want to, and be able to be private when they want to. And we've been having a discussion here about while accommodating different lifestyles, remaining inclusive and inviting. A building or a series of buildings or an approach to building might reflect how Pride started out as activism when the residents we're talking about were young, and is now more, we're thinking about inclusion and awareness So the idea of invitation is really important. Not so much perhaps, though I don't know from the first presentation, perhaps this is out of date, not so much about breaking down walls, but about welcoming people in while keeping that idea of security. And it's becoming a more diverse concept, from Berlin to Los Angeles to all the things that might have been happening tomorrow and we'll hope next year. And how will these communities adapt and evolve in the future, and how will the buildings that we're designing with them accommodate all that? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Patrick. For those of you who joined during our first two presentations, please do remember you can ask questions throughout. So if you've got a question for Patrick or David, please do post those. Our next speaker, we may have a few issues with. He's somewhere in North Wales. I've been told he's in the audience and we're going to promote him up to the panel. If we can't connect, then we'll go into our panel discussion. But we are due to be speaking with Gareth Gwynn, who's West Area Manager at London Borough Tower Hamlets, who was going to be presenting on the borough's support for the LGBT+ venue Joiners Arms, which David mentioned in his presentation. Gareth, are you there? I know Kat, our events manager, is trying to promote you into the panel.
Hello, I'm Gareth Gwynn, Planning Officer, London Borough of Tower Hamlets. I've been the lead officer dealing with the Joiners since 2014. What was the Joiners Arms? What did it represent? The words of the late and much missed Dave Pollard, landlord to the Joiners, set out on the screen, says it far better than I can say. Joiners were sadly a place I never went whilst open, but by common account it was a dingy place, hopelessly or joyfully cramped. It was a spit and sawdust LGBT+ pub in the then very run-down and somewhat underinvested part of my borough. It was the polar opposite, if you will, of a certain 1990s hygiene aesthetic that may have been found in some venues in Soho. It was truly a local community asset that also attracted people from afar. As one commentator stated, the Joiners' absence of snottiness and friendliness was one of his lasting legacies. The commentator also added, it stood for something other than rinsing the punter dry. Without getting political about these qualities of an urban space that look beyond the bottom line, about venues and urban spaces more generally, that became increasingly rare with the market allowed to let rip since 1979. And in the context of today's session, the arrival of the so-called Pink Pound in late 1990s coincided with the election of Tony Blair. This is a brief timeline around the Joiners from its opening as an LGBT+ venue in May 1997, its closure in January 2015, and 2 planning consents issued for the site in 2017 and February 2021. I do not intend to say more about it, other than to note taking things through planning takes time and provides no security. Development that was consented will be built out. And the council have no powers to effect build out, and this is quite understandably a frustration for the community, in this instance the local LGBT+ community. Developer began pre-application discussions with the council's planning department in 2014. I led on these discussions as then case officer for the scheme. And this is an image from their initial proposals, rising to 9 stories. It was a housing-led scheme that would have involved the virtual complete demolition of everything that was on site. No trace of the Joiners would have remained. It formed part of a wider redevelopment of the whole street block. The housing scheme never progressed as officers simply found it was not capable of providing good quality accommodation while simultaneously protecting the best of the built heritage on site and safeguarding neighbours' residential amenity. And this is an image of the first consented scheme, an office-led redevelopment. Still involved a reinvention of the whole street block, with sizable vertical extensions set above the retention of existing fabric, but it was felt to be much more sensitive to the Hackney Road conservation area, retaining significant amounts of the fabric on site. Former Joiners Arms present in image, minus its single-storey front element. Joiners Arms. What did the council secure through planning for it? Replacement pub next door to the existing Joiners Arms. The replacement larger in trading area than the original Joiners pub. First right of refusal for an LGBT plus operator to run the late night pub venue. Such a right has never been previously secured through a Section 106 obligation anywhere in the UK. It is truly a first, and I would contend remains a real landmark. The developer providing £138,000 to the LGBT operator to acoustically fit out the late night venue. An important achievement too in this context. Firstly to ensure the space can operate as a boisterous late night venue and be consistent with the application of the Agent of Change principle. But second, and also vitally important, it opens up the very real possibility of a non-commercial LGBT operator, like the Friends of the Joiners Arms, running this space. Rather than high fit-out costs proving an obstacle and only a commercially minded LGBT operator being in the running to take up operate in the space. The second planning consent granted for the site for the hotel redevelopment secured all the previously referenced obligations, plus secured £100,000 from the applicant for meanwhile use contribution to help Friends of the Joiners Arms operate an off-site venue space during the construction of the main development scheme. How are these planning outcomes achieved by the borough? Through application of relevant planning policy, most notably through the borough's local plan protection of community facilities policy. With the application of this to this site, it very quickly became clear that the loss of a pub on the site was not really an acceptable option, and this was conveyed to the developer. And this policy was dovetailed with groundbreaking application of duties under the Equalities Act to ensure that the replacement public house to be run by an LGBT plus operator and for the local LGBT plus community. It is often said that planning in this country concerns itself with the use and not the user. But the application of planning policy, allied to the duties under the Equality Act, allowed the profile of the user, as opposed to the merely used, to come to the fore and define what the council could secure with this application. How did the council achieve these outcomes? As well as the above, through joint working with the GLA Culture Unit, including with the nighttime czar, Amy LeMay. Through myself and others leading and helped to mediate between the concerns and demands of the local LGBT community, LGBT plus community, and the developer. By seeking to harness and learn from the energy and tireless commitment of the Friends of the Joiners Arms. I should put on record today, I have no doubt in my mind the outcomes achieved on the site would not have been achieved without the extraordinary work and campaigning by the Friends of the Joiners Arms. This slide is just put here just to highlight through the long drawn out process since the news first broke that the Joiners was going to close in 2015, that there's been a lot of media interest in the site. Most of that coverage might be described as broadly supportive, although one of those highlighted on the slide was less enlightened, from a national newspaper. And this is the Joiners today. It's a sorry picture and underlines the need for practical implementation of these obligations, including the provision of meanwhile use space to urgently fill the yawning local community facility gap. And this meanwhile use obligation should help provide an invaluable stepping stone for the Friends to potentially operate the replacement pub to the Joiners, 2 doors up from the original. Wider lessons and questions? There are many. I just highlight a few. Who has agency in the planning process? Thinking particularly of the community, mindful it is the landowners who bring forward most development in the country, not the council or the community as such. Is there a meaningful distinction to be made between LGBT plus space and LGBT plus friendly space and queer space? Thinking here of the term queer space having a much more radical notion drawn upon academic-centred queer theory. Finally, what are the implications of the government planning reforms on the redevelopment of spaces not dissimilar to the joiners in the future? Government has criticised the planning system as being too slow. On one level, everyone would want it to be quicker, no more so than those who used to frequent the joiners' homes. But good planning outcomes, I would contend, inevitably take a considerable degree of amount of time, especially if engagement with the community and user groups is not just to be a tokenistic exercise. The design that gained consent, as the earliest images of the scheme show, are very different from the applicant first sought. Achieving these revisions to design itself takes time. Finally, the government reforms place much emphasis on beauty and design coding, but invite questions: whose idea of beauty are they? Can they be shared? And is it a stable identity of beauty? And can simple formulas of design coding really deal with schemes and sites of this complexity? Thank you.
Very luckily, we are joined by Dr. Olympia Bacchularo, who is an academic and activist and part of the collective, the Friends of the Joiners' Arms. So, Olympia, perhaps you could give a little bit or more of the background of the Joiners' Arms campaign, what the lessons learned from this experience from your point of view were, and what are the ways to make sure people's experience, feelings and values are taken into consideration and valued when it comes to planning and development of these sorts of spaces.
Hi, everyone. Yes. Thanks for the introduction and for the invitation. I guess I'm going to be taking over while speaking on behalf of Gareth about some of the sort of introductions and the planning side of the campaign. So I'm from the Friends of the Joiners' Arms, which is a community organization campaigning to open London's first community-owned, community-run, late license queer pub. And the campaign was formed in early 2015 after the closure of the pub by property developers. And since then, we've secured planning protections, which will ensure that that an LGBT venue is re-provided on the site of the former site of the Joiners' Arms. And as a campaign now, we're kind of hosting drag king cabaret shows at other venues and are exploring a community ownership model as a solution to some of the problems facing queer venues in London. So a bit of context about the Joiners' Arms, which I think is quite important and interesting in relations also to some of the point that Ben was raising about the importance of or the difference between an LGBT venue or a queer venue, and what do we even mean when we're talking about these things. So the Joiners' Arms was opened by David Pollard in May 1997 on Hackney Road in the borough of Tower Hamlets, of course. And I think in many ways, it represented an East End tradition of working class pub culture that I think in many ways we could argue strongly contrasted with both Shoreditch's sort of rapidly gentrifying and more fashionable bar scene, but also with the city's most famous, which some have referred to as cosmopolitan and classy gay enclave of Soho. So, for example, David famously said things such as, and this is a quote, so if you want to enjoy yourself, come in, but we don't want to know how important you are. Are you interesting to talk to? Are you a good shag? Can you dance? These are the questions we're interested in as a pub, right? So this is kind of the energy that the Joiners' Arms embodied. So that's a bit of a sort of background. But what actually happened in terms of planning? So I think whilst initially the aim of our campaign was to save the Joiners from closure, I think we ended up actually building a campaign not only to save the Joiners, but to turn it into a community-run, not-for-profit queer bar. So what we did was in January, I think 2015, we successfully registered the Joiners Arms as an asset of community value. And this was actually the same week that the Joiners closed its doors. And it's important to note that actually remains closed to this day. So we realized, I think quite quickly, that we couldn't actually manage to stop the redevelopment of the site. So instead we pushed and negotiated with the council, including Gareth, to provide an LGBTQ+ venue on the former site of the Joiners on account that this was an asset of community value. And the plans were finally put to the Tower Hamlets Development Committee in 2017. And again, I think in 2021, just quite recently. And we won, I guess, historic planning protections for the Joiners, in which the development of the larger sites was only approved on the condition that a replacement LGBTQ+ bar be built that would have things such as an LGBTQ+ operator for 25 years. And we also secured sort of financial contributions for the campaign to run a meanwhile use space to compensate the LGBT community for the years that the Joiners sat empty and still counting. And I guess this was like very much celebrated as the first time that the LGBTness of a space was used as a condition to approve redevelopment, secured through a Section 106 agreement. And I guess what this means is that, so whilst we weren't able to actually stop the redevelopment, there will be an LGBT venue re-provided on the former side of the Joiners. And then now we have a bit of money to invest in, I guess, not yet, but hopefully we will, in operating a meanwhile use space whilst this is getting built. I actually see Gareth is connecting to the audio. I don't know what that means.
Well, we'll see if we can connect to him, but if you want to carry on, and then if we can, we'll go to Gareth.
All right. I mean, so the question that you asked was, I guess, what are the lessons that we've learned from this experience of campaigning, I guess, and engaging with planning as from the perspective of like queer activism, I guess. Can you hear me? Sorry, there's something really noisy in the background. All right. So, and I think the first lesson that I wanted to share was that it's actually quite hard, I think, to re-engineer queerness and to provide a queer venue once it's been closed. And I would say, particularly thinking about the kinds of comments or understandings of queerness that David sort of had. So I think on the one hand, you have challenges, I think, pertaining to gentrification and redevelopment itself. So for example, the Joiners operated for 18 years as a late license venue. And the late license was seen by many, in fact, as an integral element of its queerness. So, for example, its ability to cater to those LGBT people working in other LGBT venues around the area, its ability to cater for those queers who we could argue are queer not simply or only by virtue of their gender and sexuality, but because perhaps they lived lives beyond like 9 to 5 temporal logics which govern a lot of like middle class people's lives. So, but also partly due to the fact that sort of licenses fall under different authorities, so it's not necessarily development and planning, but also partly, dare I say, mostly due to the changing character of the area itself, which was actually much more residential now and developed. A late license could actually not be included as part of a Section 106. So, and I think it's important to say here as well that the property developers, Regal Homes, were the ones who were involved in a number of projects across and around the venue that had contributed to the gentrification of the area. And by residential, I don't mean affordable housing, but luxury flats that sell at an average price of £150,000. So these are kind of some of the challenges associated with the late license and re-providing queerness. And I think on the other hand, we also had challenges pertaining to what an LGBT, I mean, some things that Ben were saying kind of resonated with this, but pertaining to what an LGBT or queer venue even is. So I really like the questions that you asked as well. So again, so if you ask people, when I ask people what they liked and cherished about the Joiners Arms, I would usually get responses, something along the lines of, it was wonky, it was weird, it was queer, it was great, which is not something that you can easily legislate or plan into being. And I mean, interestingly as well, kind of thinking about this question of visibility, one time I met someone at the Joiners who loved the Joiners because he wasn't out in his community and the Joiners didn't have a rainbow flag outside, which meant he could go and feel safe and no one would know and no one would clock him, and it was great. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that we can and maybe should be much more, well, I mean, I don't know who I'm talking to, I think most people agree, but here, but we can be sort of more expansive and creative and radical about what we mean by LGBTness or queerness when we're trying to provide an LGBT plus or queer venue, whatever. And I think this queerness is like, I mean, now I know who I'm talking to. This queerness is not necessarily something that can be re-provided by sticking a rainbow flag outside a building, as the LGBTQ venues charter developed by Amy LeMay suggested, and others. And it's definitely not something that I think, in my opinion, can be seamlessly re-provided by collaborating with property developers. I think this also relates to the second lesson that I learned, which is that I think we need to go beyond sort of mere inclusion of LGBTQ plus experiences, feelings, and values in development and planning. And I think maybe what we need when it comes to planning and development, this is the kind of questions I've been thinking is like, what does agency even mean when you're going up against corporate actors with money, time, and lawyers? And here maybe I'm talking about our agency as activists, but maybe also that of planners. I don't know, maybe Gareth wants to talk about that. Or that of architects. I mean, I don't know. But I mean, what does agency even mean when in order to engage and navigate planning and win, you need to rely on hours and years of unpaid labor? You need to learn how to navigate planning legislation, etc. So and this is why I also think it's quite funny in many ways that our campaign and the Section 106 and kind of is often celebrated and sold as the success story. I mean, I don't mean to argue that it's not, but I think I'm just kind of mindful about who gets to use that term or that phrase, because the pub, as Ben was also saying, kind of is still closed. And I think what we've learned is actually that commitments to LGBT diversity and inclusion are okay, but ultimately maybe the goal is something that actually is maybe much bigger and broader than that. And I would go as far as saying that the problem, so kind of riffing off some of the themes or questions like of the event, this event itself, is like maybe that the problem of queer friendliness in London is not that queer communities are not taken into consideration and valued, but that what is considered to be valuable depends on what is of value to property developers in the economy, and that some forms of diversity, including LGBT diversity, can and have been accommodated with that, but some forms cannot, and will not. And I think I'm much less interested in those that can be accommodated, simply because that's not the forms of diversity that I think the Joiners catered to. And for me, I think this is kind of where the conversation is happening, more at the grassroots level against the power of property developers in a way. So for example, see the successes of like the Save the Latin Village campaign in Seven Sisters a few months ago against Granger. So I think these are the kinds of questions these are the lessons I've learned in terms of like, how do we create the conditions within which London's queerness can flourish? I think I'll stop there and see if Gareth wants to say something.
Yeah, what I might do, I just want to unpick a few things there. There's a lot of amazing response there, Olympia. So I think a couple of things that I picked up from that is, one thing that we encounter with developers and partners of ours is when we talk about communities, it's really community, and it's seen as this kind of amorphous thing, and actually seeing communities as separate things and having separate identities is really important. And certainly on the LGBTQ plus side, that is something that feels like an afterthought a lot of the time. And then your other point around, actually the value to developers, to architects in sort of queerness, you do get, and I actually wish Adam Nathaniel Furman was on this call. He's very good at talking about this, the pink washing that happens a lot of the time with, you might have LGBT plus artists or performers or something involved in a development around cultural activation and placemaking, which kind of adds their kind of agency and their value, but actually doesn't support the community that they're part of. And I think that's something that we absolutely need to address. It needs to be kind of a meaningful inclusion as part of that. And the other thing you said, which I think is really, really important, and it sort of brings back a lot of nostalgia for me around all of these venues we're talking about, is the idea that, it's not just a name and a group of people, but the physical space has such an important, has such a value. And I can think of a number of different bars and clubs who sort of have been moved to, and David referred to the sort of cheaper areas of town, and it's never the same. It's never the same. But the Pop Stars had this thing where it moved around, but multiple venues have done that. So actually the physical spaces are so important themselves, and actually thinking about how we retain those and enhance those as part of new development, I think is really, really important. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to come to David first. I've got a question for David, and then we'll try and get to Gareth and see if we can have his connection work. But just hearing everything we've heard.
Can you hear me, Ben?
Yes, we can hear you. Gareth, why don't you go ahead and say a bit more about joiners and your thoughts on what you've heard so far today?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been a really fascinating discussion, and I think what Olympia saying is really interesting, and it comes back to questions of agency and the community, whether that's the LGBT community or any other community. What's their involvement? How do they lead in the development of our city, the evolution of our city? I mean, obviously, I work for Tower Hamlets in the planning department, and we have to respond to what we have a set of rules, the development plan that sort of sets the framework, but then inevitably we just have to deal with what's put before us, and so we work in a capitalist market-led economy, so it will come as no surprise that the majority of the changes that the city sees will be led by the development industry, and we have to manage that process. And we can't beat head on, if you like, the gentrification argument. We can't stop development. We have to take a positive attitude to development that is consistent with planning. And Ben, I think your comments about trying to sort of pink washing is a really valid one. I mean, I think this one's a really interesting one. I mean, I think developer Eagle Homes should be given some credit, but I think in a sense, the history of it, when it began, it wasn't an easy one. They were quite properly seen, if you like, as being part of the process of closing it. So it wasn't an easy relationship when it began. And I think there's no easy answers where development takes place and where in like the Joiners, it was a dingy sawdust pub, and that was part of the that was the wonder of it, and it was for celebration for everybody, all classes. How do you? We've secured through the planning system a new space within it. We've secured extraordinary obligations connected with it, but can we recreate? I mean, in a sense, how that space operates is for whoever takes up the operator. Yeah, but will it have the same qualities as the previous one? Inevitably not. I mean, in some ways, I hope it could be a better space. And I hope it'll allow opportunities for a community space, if you like, set aside from a drinking den space, and then they can work simultaneously. But it's a challenge from a planning officer, from a council perspective. We just have to deal with what we've got before us, I guess.
You said something very interesting there, Gareth, which was it's this idea that, and it goes back again to Olympia's point about value. And I think it kind of goes back to the whole diversity piece in general. And there's this, through our Diverse Leaders program, we've got lots of research we can refer to, just actually the value to businesses and companies of having diverse workforces and appealing to diverse audiences. It's exactly the same with spaces. And there is data to suggest you will be more profitable if you cater to those communities. So there is a disconnect between what is happening in London and globally, and what developers and architects and to some extent local authorities think the public want and think will be valuable versus what actually is valuable. And it's kind of, how do we get this across to, this isn't just, you know, tokenism. This isn't just you ticking a box around diversity. There is a huge amount of value in providing these sorts of spaces. I'm going to come to David next, and then I've got a question for Patrick. So David, have you got thoughts through your research on ways that we can get that message across? And we've spoken a bit about Section 106 and how we might make that work. And there is a question in the chat, which I'll bring back to Olympia.
Sorry, which message was that?
So, how do you think we can get the message that there is huge amounts of value in diverse spaces across to local authorities, developers? What's the best way that we can do this, do you think?
That's not an easy question.
It's a hard question, that's why I asked it.
I think, I mean, the fact that we're talking about it in the first place is really important. And I think, I mean, as much as we've all gone through the challenges of the last year, we have all missed these spaces. And I think the absence of them gives us all reason to realize why they're so important to us. And if we can, as community, LGBTQ plus communities, we can manifest our arguments for it, it gives us a stronger hand. How we can actually get the policymakers to listen, I don't know. I mean, I think what the Mayor of London have done with the LGBTQ plus charter is interesting, and the fact that they're talking about it is good, but I agree that there are failings in that, and it's in some ways quite reductive. But yeah, I don't have a clear answer to your question there.
I think if there was one, we'd probably be there. So it's good to pick everyone's brains anyway. Patrick, I was really fascinated by your presentation, because actually it didn't occur to me that one of the reasons we don't have these sorts of spaces is because there's this disconnect between, the providers saying, well, actually, there aren't any LGBT older people, which is just absolutely mind-blowing to me. How do we, sort of similar question for Olympia, what are kind of the learnings that you might be able to share that we can maybe work across other kinds of LGBT spaces that you worked on this project?
I mean, the biggest single learning is that nobody can understand it until it's there. I know that sounds a bit weird, but the older women's co-housing, it wasn't a huge amount of resistance, but the council didn't get it. They didn't really want it to happen. And then it finally, through the women's perseverance, more than anything else, but also housing association support, it got built. And they just deluged the whole time when people wanted to live there, because you can see it, right? So this is where what we're all saying, I think, comes together. There is a huge problem across the whole of society about how do you make those spaces that people want to be in, because you can't kind of manufacture them from a template. You need to give people, and the word agency has been used several times. It's a really good word. The ray of a few chinks of sunshine. So one is that during COVID, all the bad things that happened were not balanced by, but they're also not erased by the fact of local areas and their identity becoming more important to people actually not just going straight into the middle of town to work and coming back, making, new small venues, cafes, pop-ups or whatever. If you're doing that, you can express what you want that to be, rather than just having to fit, what the late capitalist template, Gareth, would think is profitable, because it doesn't know. It'll pick up on anything, right, that turns out to be popular. Because everything is, this is really depressing, but everything is monetized, isn't it? Our data, our exchanges, our dating, it's all part of the same game. So the trick is individuals have to try and take control of some of that, and that applies to property development as much as everything else. It's just a very, very high investment game. So I guess there are lots of really positive words coming from lots of London councils, from the mayor. Their money isn't generally yet where their mouth is, right? So they're not prepared yet to make the investment that will give a huge return in community capital, not very far down the road. So how do we make that happen? That's my take, I guess.
I think perhaps we might have to bring a think tank of people together to get some messages across. We've got a couple of audience questions. The first one we've sort of touched on a little bit, and it's definitely a really critical one. It's around rental rates. But the question is, one problem I've had with Section 106 agreements to secure replacement cultural spaces is the rental rates the developers offer, which make the spaces unaffordable. Has this been a problem with the Joiners Arms? How has Tower Hamlets managed this issue? If I go to perhaps Olympia first and then Gareth. So Olympia, just on the rental rates, have you got thoughts on that?
Yeah, really quick. I think so I only touched upon the fact that the planning protections included that the new venue had to have an LGBTQ plus operator for 25 years, but we also did win, I think, if I'm not mistaken, 1 year rent free. However, after which it will be at market value, from what I understand. So that itself also places some massive limitations about who can even be the LGBTQ plus whatever operator. As mentioned, we're planning to run a space, that space, whatever, as a community run, community owned, sort of not-for-profit kind of venue, so that will sort of raise its own challenges. But that totally valid question. Exactly, yes. Over maybe to Gareth.
Yeah, so Gareth, is that your sort of a standard?
Yeah, I mean, it was secured, I think, rent-free for 18 months in the end. I think importantly, we also secured that the rate that the lease would be, the first lease would be for 7 years, so that whoever goes in knows what it is. It is a market rate. I'm not going to profess it's the cheapest rate, but I mean, I think the most challenging thing, and I think what we have achieved, is so often we just achieve a fit out. We get to find a space, but it's shell and core. And with the consent, we secured £138,000 to allow fit out, primarily around, if you like, acoustics, ensure that it could be a late night venue, and it's been secured, so it's got planning conditions to be open until 4 o'clock in the morning. But if we hadn't secured that, then I think it would be very challenging for the Friends of the Joiners or an LGBT operator who wasn't just got an eye on the bottom line to take up that space, because I think that initial hurdle of the 130 of getting that fit out would just mean that they would be priced out. So, I would say this, but I think that's an extraordinary sort of outcome and goes above and beyond. And I hear the comments about the GLA Charter. Again, I think the Joiners is an interesting one, because the GLA Charter is engaged and sort of helps define the terms of reference about what an LGBT operator would need to be for the space, but it actually goes above and beyond that, because the local LGBT community will be involved. I mean, slightly to the ridicule of the Daily Mail article, but it'll be involved in helping to choose who is an appropriate operator that could demonstrate their credentials. Yes, they'll have to have a business case, but I think critically they'll have to set how they demonstrate that they're serving the LGBT community in a way like the old Joiners was. Yes, it was a spit and sawdust pub, but it was much more than that. And it provides that space for that.
There's kind of an interesting precedent now though with COVID and the sort of the business rates break and sort of the model we've been seeing around that, and I wonder if there's something there which something to think about. We've got another question here which seems to be a discussion here about queering the planning process. David mentioned listing, Ollie using Section 106. What other strategies do you think could be used to queer the planning system as planners and architects? I wanted to come to David just to think about the transparency of the planning process, and perhaps that's an issue that we have and how we can rectify that.
Yeah, I think even for those of us within the field of the built environment, we all are aware of how challenging it is to negotiate the planning portal, to negotiate the way in which the planning system works, to understand what S106 actually is. So I don't understand how we can expect queer venue owners and business owners to really engage with that process if we as the professionals struggle with it ourselves. So I think, we all need to think an overhaul of the planning process is probably a good idea. I would assume. But I think if we could make it more accessible to those people, so they could really get their voices heard, that would help to queer the process as such. And I really like this term of queering something. I think it's a really positive sort of concept.
Thank you. Olympia, any thoughts on that, queering the planning process?
No, I mean, I obviously agree with David. I also, I mean, I think what's really interesting about this discussion is that even sort of hearing my comments and in relation to Gareth is that we also do come at this, like we all agree, but we do kind of come at this from different perspectives. So I think where my querying the planning process lies in, for example, workshops and training for other anti-gentrification campaigns on how to like mess with the developers or with the planning process. But I like the idea of people working on the inside, people working on the outside, to sort of, I think it's really important that those things kind of all happen at once. Yeah, I think that's my thoughts on that.
Thank you. Gareth, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to look, there's a place for kind of challenging, you know, the gentrification and so forth, a radical agenda, and that's fine. It's obviously not where I could do in my professional life. I think in terms of querying the planning system, I think there is something important in the joiners, because the planning system's always interested in the use, but not the users. Yeah. So whether that's a JD Wetherspoons that goes into the space, or the Friends of the Joiners, in the normal rules of the game, the planning system can't privilege one over the other. Yeah, I think, you know, the kind of the landmark of the joiners and this extraordinary robustness, you know, in kind of legal matters, and I think this is important because it can be used elsewhere. It is the fact that we used our policy, local plan policy, protect community facilities. The pub, that was easy. We set that out day one when we met the developers. Yeah, but it was the way we allied that, dovetailed that with our duties under the Equalities Act, and then we would be able to apply the Equalities Impact Assessment. We could see that it was going to protect particular protected characteristics, by sexuality and gender, and then that allowed us to say, well, yes, it has to be the first right of refusal for an LGBT operator. So I think that is really important. And then, as I say, for the reasons that we secured it to be given the space, the landscape, that it doesn't have to be a commercial operator, I think gives an opportunity. I hope that we can have some. There's LGBT is important in the planning system. Is LGBT friendly spaces and LGBT specific spaces, but I am interested in the gay theory, if you like, of queer spaces and a more radical spaces, places that don't accept sort of fixed ideas of identity or conformity. Yeah? And it says the joiners was that, truly. It was a boisterous place where the normal rules didn't apply. Yeah. And it is very hard when you're creating something space in a shiny new build and its investment to do that. But I think there is that window is open. Yeah, we can't recreate the dinginess, but I think there is. I do hope the Friends of the Joiners do go in here and reinvent it. And I'm sure it'll be a more inviting place, a more diverse space as well. But yeah, it's a fascinating discussion.
Thanks very much, Gareth. That's true. You can't recreate the dinginess of places like Ghetto and the Joiners, certainly, but hopefully one day we'll find out how we do that. We are at time now, so I want to thank all of our panelists. It was a really fascinating discussion. I think this is kind of the start, hopefully, of a broader discussion. We at NLA would love to be involved in perhaps working on shaping policy and suggestions around policy for this. Thank you for all joining today on a Friday morning. We're now going to have just a quick short poll for the audience, just to let us know what you thought about the event and what you'd like to see coming up. Do check out our Diverse Leaders page on the NLA website, which has more information about our pledge, which is an industry-wide pledge. And hopefully I'll see you at the next event. Thank you all again for coming. Bye-bye.